In today's video, we're going to talk about 6 times people were eaten alive by sharks. From a Mexican spear fisherman whose 20 years in the water couldn't save him, to a Red Sea tour guide who spent 11 years reading that ocean and missed the one sign that mattered most. But first, let's start with a financial analyst from Perth who paid an illegal charter to put him in the water with one of the largest great white sharks. The morning of July 22, 2014 arrived cold and gray over South Australia's coastline. Winter at the Neptune Islands comes off the Southern Ocean in long, flat waves of cold that sit in your chest long after you have gone back inside. The water was dark. The sky was darker. It was not a place that invited you. It was a place that tolerated you briefly, on its own terms. Daniel Kessler had told himself that many times and found it thrilling every time. Daniel was 38, a financial analyst from Perth who had spent the better part of his adult life inside spreadsheets and boardrooms. He was sharp, methodical, and by every professional measure, successful. But success had come at a cost he hadn't anticipated, a creeping restlessness that no salary could quiet. He had started small, a skydiving course on a long weekend. He believed, with the conviction of someone who had never truly been wrong, that risk was simply a variable, one that could be managed if the right professionals were involved. That belief is what led him to the wrong boat. It wasn't one of the licensed operators. The vessel was smaller, the paperwork thinner, and the pitch far more seductive. A more immersive shark experience, they called it. No cages, no barriers, just you and the ocean. Legitimate Neptune Islands operators are bound by strict regulations. Cage diving only, controlled chumming, no free-swimming clients in active chum water. This charter operated outside all of that. The crew spoke with the confidence of people who had done this before and gotten away with it. Daniel liked the sound of what they were selling. He signed what they put in front of him and didn't ask the questions he should have. Chumming had already begun by the time they reached the site, a slow bleed of scent trailing into deep water. The crew moved with the casual efficiency of people running an operation that existed in the gap between what was permitted and what was possible. Daniel suited up, entered the water near the vessel, and for a while, everything felt exactly as he had imagined it. Then, at the edge of visibility, a shape appeared, large, slow, almost elegant in the way it moved. Wide, unhurried circles that seemed almost indifferent to his presence. He watched it. It watched him. He raised his camera. That was when he drifted. It happened gradually, the way most fatal mistakes do, not in a single moment of recklessness, but in a slow accumulation of small inattentions. He was focused on the frame, on the angle, on capturing something extraordinary. He didn't notice how far he had moved from the boat. He didn't notice that he had turned his back to open water. He didn't notice that the shark's wide, patient circles had been getting smaller with every pass. The strike came from below with no warning. The shark accelerated from depth in a single explosive burst, an upward ambush, the full mechanical force of nearly 5 meters of animal hitting him from underneath. The bite was catastrophic, his lower body. The shark released almost immediately, the way great whites do, and pulled away into the dark water below. Daniel surfaced. The crew was already moving, shouting, the engine turning over. The water around him had changed color. His body understood what had happened before his mind could form the thought. He did not have long. The injuries from that single strike were not survivable. Blood loss and shock worked faster than the boat could close the distance. Western Australian authorities launched an investigation within days. The charter operator was identified, the vessel impounded, and the business shut down permanently. The operator faced criminal charges related to negligent conduct and operating without the required licensing. Back in Perth, Daniel's family held a private service. But if Daniel's story is a warning about the dangers of manufactured adventure, the next story is a warning about something even more primal. What happens when a man who knows the ocean better than almost anyone alive makes the one mistake he cannot take back? The afternoon of March 3, 2016, brought the kind of calm to Mexico's Pacific coast that makes the water look harmless. The surface ran clear and warm, visibility stretching deep into the reef below. The drop-offs where the shelf fell away into open blue looking from above, like nothing more than a change in color. It was beautiful water. It was also hunting water, and the two things were not unrelated. Miguel Alvarez knew this better than most. He was 44, a veteran spear fisherman who had worked these reefs for over 2 decades, building a reputation up and down the coastline for bringing in larger catches than anyone else and doing it alone. He was lean and weathered in the way that men who spend their lives in the ocean tend to be, unhurried on land, completely at home underwater. Younger fishermen watched the way he moved through the water and understood that it had taken years to look that effortless. What they didn't know was that the effortlessness was under pressure. Financial strain had been building for months, quietly at first, then with an urgency that changed the way Miguel worked. Longer dives, riskier drop-offs, fewer rest days. He had started hunting the reef edges where pelagic species ran deeper and larger, the kind of spots that paid better precisely because they demanded more. His friends had noticed the shift. A few had said something. Miguel had listened politely and gone back, out alone the next morning. On March 3rd, he chose a reef drop-off he knew well, or believed he did. He descended with his spear gun and worked the reef with the efficiency of long practice. Over the course of the dive, he was successful. Several fish, secured to a stringer attached at his waist, trailed behind him as he worked. It was a good day, the kind of day that justified the risk. He didn't notice the silhouette at first. It appeared at the edge of his vision, broad, slow-moving, unhurried in the way that large predators can afford to be. A tiger shark, somewhere around 4 meters, making wide passes at a distance that felt almost respectful. Miguel had seen sharks before. He stayed still, kept his movements controlled, and watched it the way it was watching him. For a time, the standoff held. Then the shark made a low pass. Close, but not striking. Almost casual, the kind of approach that experienced divers recognize as a test. It pulled away and circled again, each pass slightly tighter than the last. The distance between them was shrinking in increments small enough to rationalize but large enough to matter. Miguel made his decision too late. He chose not to release his catch immediately. The fish represented hours of work, real money, a day that had gone well in a stretch of days that hadn't. He hesitated, and in that hesitation, something shifted. By the time he began his ascent, the shark had already closed the distance in a way that left no room for negotiation. The strike came from the side, fast, total, and without the telegraphing that the earlier passes had suggested. A bite to his midsection with the full force of an animal that had made its decision. Miguel was stopped mid-water. The shark pulled away, but the withdrawal was brief. Blood was already spreading through the water in a volume that changed everything around it. What followed was not a structured sequence. It was faster than that, and more chaotic. The shark came back before Miguel had any chance to orient himself. Another contact. Harder, less exploratory. His body was recovered later that afternoon by a fishing vessel working the same stretch of coast. The stringer was still there, the fish he had chosen not to release, still attached to the man who had made that choice. Miguel left behind a wife and 2 teenage sons. Miguel's death was the death of a man undone by the very expertise that had kept him alive for so long, the confidence that had stopped being a tool and become a blind spot. But the next story happened somewhere that felt far safer, on the surface, in calm water, in the middle of a perfectly ordinary afternoon. The morning of November 11th, 2017 found the Central Pacific exactly as it had been for days. Flat, relentless blue in every direction, the horizon unbroken, the water below the vessel shifting from turquoise to a deep, lightless navy the further from shore you went. It was the kind of ocean that looked peaceful from the deck of a boat. From the water, it looked like something else entirely. Hannah Brooks had been at sea for 4 days when she decided to get in. Hannah was 29, a travel content creator from Sydney whose channel had grown steadily over 3 years on the back of one simple promise. She would go where other creators wouldn't. No safety nets, no staged moments, no comfortable distance between herself and the world she was filming. Her audience loved her for it. They loved the unfiltered quality of her content, the sense that they were seeing something real. Hannah loved it too. She loved the feeling of being exactly at the edge of something, and she had built a career out of finding that edge and stepping toward it. That instinct had served her well across 3 years of travel content. Remote jungle treks, overnight stays in places with no infrastructure, open water swims in locations that made her followers' palms sweat just watching. She had never been seriously hurt. She had come to think of that as evidence that her judgment was sound, that her instincts were reliable, that the line she kept approaching was one she understood. The vessel was crossing a remote stretch of the Pacific when she had the idea. The conditions were perfect: calm surface, good light, the kind of deep blue open ocean that photographs like a dream. She convinced the crew to stop. Just a few minutes in the water, she told them, a swim segment. The crew was hesitant. This was deep, isolated ocean, far from any coastline, the kind of water that oceanic white-tip sharks treat as their private territory. But Hannah was persuasive, and the conditions looked benign, and eventually they agreed. She entered the water with her camera. For the first few minutes, everything was exactly what she had imagined. The ocean stretched in every direction, vast and blue and silent. Then, quietly, the small fish that had been visible near the surface disappeared. The water below her seemed to empty out in a way that had no obvious explanation. Hannah didn't stop filming. The first shark appeared at distance, A slow, wide circle, its movements unhurried and deliberate. Hannah kept the camera rolling. A second shape appeared further out, less engaged but present. She kept filming. What she didn't recognize, or didn't allow herself to recognize, was that the first shark's circles were getting smaller. Each pass brought it incrementally closer, the behavior shifting from curiosity into something that marine biologists would later describe as active investigation. The escalation was gradual enough to rationalize at every individual step, and Hannah rationalized every one of them. The shark came from behind and below, a single exploratory bite to her leg, the kind of contact researchers call investigative. It pulled away. For a fraction of a second, there was stillness. Then, Hannah reacted. The rapid movement, the splashing, the sudden disruption at the surface. It changed everything instantly. Blood entered the water. On the boat, the crew was already shouting, someone throwing a line, another scrambling for the ladder. The water between the vessel and Hannah was no longer a place anyone could safely enter. The first shark turned back, faster now, the earlier deliberateness gone. The second shark began closing in, drawn by the disturbance, its movements less measured than the first. What followed was faster and more disorganized than anything the earlier circling had suggested. The primary shark came back hard. There was contact, chaos at the surface, the crew screaming from the deck. A line hit the water near Hannah, but the distance was wrong, the angle was wrong, and the situation was escalating faster than any of it could be corrected. The second shark was close now, circling the disturbance, occasionally lunging toward the surface. Hannah Brooks sustained fatal injuries in the water before she could be brought back aboard. The ocean, it turns out, does not care about your following. But as terrifying as it is to face a predator in open water, in a place where you know, on some level, that you are not supposed to be, there is something uniquely disturbing about the stories where the danger doesn't find you in the wild, where it finds you in a river, in murky water, in a place that felt like nothing more than a way to cool down after a long day's work. The afternoon of August 9th, 2013, was the kind of day that made the West African coast feel like the inside of a furnace. August is the peak of the wet season along that stretch of coastline. The air sits heavy and wet from the moment the sun comes up, and weeks of inland rain had been swelling the rivers, turning the water at the coast brown and opaque where the fresh water pushed out into the sea. The river mouths looked, that afternoon, like churned earth, murky, slow-moving, and completely unreadable from the surface. Victor Sands had walked past that river mouth every working day for 3 months. Victor was 51, a construction supervisor from Dakar who had spent 30 years doing hard, unglamorous work in conditions that most people in comfortable countries never think about. He was practical, experienced, and entirely uninterested in risk for its own sake. He managed crews, solved problems, and kept projects moving in places where the infrastructure made everything harder than it needed to be. He was not a man who sought out difficulty. He was a man who absorbed it, quietly, and kept going. The workers on his site had been cooling off in the river mouth for weeks, a routine that had developed organically in the absence of any alternative. Victor had joined them occasionally, wading in at the edges, never going far. What Victor didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the weeks of heavy rainfall had created conditions that were drawing bull sharks inshore. Bull sharks are unlike almost any other species in the water. They move freely between salt and fresh water. They are territorial and aggressive by nature, and they thrive in exactly the kind of low-visibility, brackish environment that the river mouth had become. They don't hunt by sight. They hunt by electroreception and vibration. They feel the pressure of a moving body through the water with a precision that has no human equivalent. The murk that made the river mouth look harmless was, for a bull shark, ideal. On the afternoon of August 9th, Victor entered the water alone. The other workers had already come and gone. He waded in deeper than he usually did. The heat had been particularly brutal that day, and the water offered immediate relief. He stood in water that reached his chest, in conditions he had no framework to evaluate as dangerous, in a river mouth that a bull shark had almost certainly been using as a feeding corridor. He never saw it coming. Nothing in the water gave any indication. No shape at the edge of visibility, no change in the current, no warning of any kind. The contact was instantaneous and total. There was no circling, no investigative pass, no escalation, just an explosive strike from the murk with no preamble whatsoever. The force of it pulled him under. He resurfaced, and within seconds, not a structured pause, not a retreat, just seconds, the shark was on him again. Bull shark attacks in these conditions follow exactly this pattern: explosive, rapid, with almost no interval between contacts. The water around Victor became violent in a way that the bystanders on the bank could hear before they could fully process what they were seeing. Victor Sands was incapacitated almost immediately. The injuries were not survivable. The people who ran toward the water's edge reached it within moments, but there was nothing to be done. His body was recovered downstream later that evening. Local authorities documented the attack and contacted regional wildlife officials, who confirmed that bull shark activity in river mouths along that stretch of coastline increased significantly during the wet season, a fact that was known to wildlife management, but had never been formally communicated to the construction crews working near the water. No warning signs had been posted. And yet, for all the randomness of what happened to Victor Sands, there is something almost more disturbing about a death that arrives not from a moment of inattention or bad luck, but from a deliberate choice, from a young man who knew the risks, who had been warned, and who paddled out anyway, alone, before the sun had even risen. The early hours of June 18, 2018 brought the fog that Northern California surfers know well. Thick, low, rolling in off the Pacific before dawn, and sitting on the water until mid-morning, muffling sound, flattening the light, turning the ocean's surface into something gray and featureless. The water was cold. The visibility beneath the surface was poor. In those conditions before sunrise, that stretch of coastline felt like the edge of the world. For most surfers, that was reason enough to wait. Kyle Morrison had been awake since 4 a.m. Kyle was 24, a surfer from Santa Cruz who had spent the last 2 years chasing professional recognition with the kind of single-minded focus that people either admire or worry about, depending on how well they know you. He was talented, genuinely, visibly talented. But talent in surfing without sponsorship is just a hobby with better stories. And Kyle wanted more than stories. He wanted the kind of wave that didn't exist at the crowded breaks where everyone was already watching everyone else. He had a truck, a quiver of boards, and the ability to read a swell forecast well enough to find waves that most surfers didn't know existed or didn't bother to chase. His friends admired the commitment. A few of them worried about the alone part. Kyle didn't. He had identified the break weeks earlier, a remote point along a stretch of coastline that produced powerful, consistent waves and saw almost no foot traffic. It also sat adjacent to a rocky offshore area that served as a seal colony. He knew this. Seal colonies mean great whites, and great whites along the Northern California coast are not a rumor or a rarity. They are a documented, well-studied presence, particularly in the early morning hours when low light makes surface hunting conditions optimal. Kyle knew the biology. He had read about it. He paddled out anyway, alone, before sunrise, on a morning when the fog was thick and the underwater visibility was poor. Below him, a subadult, great white, around 3.5 meters, not yet fully grown but already operating with the full predatory capability of its species, was working the area. Subadult great whites are in some ways more unpredictable than mature animals in these encounters. They are still calibrating, still learning to discriminate between prey, and they make contact more readily than older sharks that have developed more precise hunting instincts. Kyle lay on his board in the pre-dawn dark, paddling into position, his silhouette against the faint light of the surface looking from below, exactly like what the shark was hunting. The strike came upward, fast and total, the classic great white ambush from depth, the kind of attack that gives no warning because the warning would defeat the purpose. The force of the impact hit both the board and his lower body simultaneously, knocking him into the water. The shark released and moved off into the dark water below. Kyle surfaced. There was a stillness then, the kind that follows something too large to immediately understand. The water around him was changing. He was alone, in the dark, a long way from shore, and the injuries from that single strike had already decided the outcome. Great whites in California are well documented to disengage after an initial bite. The attack on Kyle was no exception. The shark did not return. The damage from one contact with an animal of that size, at that speed, from that angle, was catastrophic and complete. Kyle Morrison lost the ability to stay afloat. He died in the water before any assistance could reach him. His board washed ashore later that morning, the bite marks along the rail used by marine biologists to estimate the shark's size. Kyle's truck was found parked at the trailhead above the break, his phone inside. His body was recovered from the water that afternoon by the Coast Guard. Kyle's story is the story of a young man who understood the risk and accepted it, which makes it tragic in a way that is different from the others. But perhaps the most haunting stories are not the ones that happen in wild, remote places, not in the open Pacific or along an empty California coastline. Sometimes the most dangerous place is a reef you have guided tourists through 100 times before, in water you know so well you have stopped paying attention to what it might be telling you. The morning of September 27th, 2015 was everything the Red Sea is known for in the final weeks of summer. The water was warm and extraordinarily clear, visibility stretching 30 meters in every direction. The reef below lit up in the way that makes people understand why they traveled thousands of miles to be here. The surface was flat, the winds light, and the conditions were, by every visible measure, perfect. Ahmed Nasser had described mornings exactly like this one to tourists for 11 years. Ahmed was 36, a Red Sea tour guide based out of Hurghada, who had led more snorkeling trips than he could count across a career that had started when he was barely out of school. He knew the water the way people know their own neighborhoods, the currents, the reef formations, the way the light changed through the afternoon, the spots that were reliable and the spots that required more care. He was calm and competent in the water, the kind of guide that tourists trusted immediately, because he carried himself like someone who had never been surprised by anything the ocean had done. That familiarity was, in the end, the thing that killed him. He had chosen an offshore site that day specifically because it was less crowded, a quieter alternative to the main tourist reefs, further out, with better visibility and more interesting marine life. It was a site he had used before without incident. What he didn't know was that a fishing vessel had discarded fish waste in the area earlier that morning. The scent trail was already in the water by the time Ahmed's group arrived. The ocean, from the surface, looked exactly as it always did. His group entered the water in good spirits, a mix of experienced snorkelers and beginners, the kind of group Ahmed had managed dozens of times. He positioned himself at the edge of the group as he always did, watching the perimeter, keeping count. For the first few minutes, the dive was everything he had promised. Clear water, healthy reef, the kind of underwater visibility that makes people understand why people become obsessed with the ocean. Then the fish disappeared. It happened quietly. The reef fish that had been moving through the coral simply weren't there anymore. The water grew still in a way that had a different quality than ordinary stillness. Ahmed noticed it. He had seen something like this before. But 11 years of leading tours without a serious incident had built a layer of professional confidence that sat between his instincts and his decisions. And in that moment, the confidence won. He began moving the group toward the boat, calmly, without alarming anyone, the way a good guide does. He did not call them out urgently. He did not treat it as an emergency. The oceanic whitetip appeared shortly after, a single shark, moving with the slow, deliberate confidence that characterizes the species in open water. It began circling at a moderate distance. Ahmed watched it and kept the group moving. He had seen sharks on tours before. Then one of the swimmers panicked. Everything changed at once. The splashing, the sudden erratic movement at the surface, the noise, it hit the water like a signal. The shark's behavior shifted immediately, its wide circles collapsing inward. Ahmed moved toward the panicking swimmer without hesitation, placing himself between the group and the shark, doing exactly what a responsible guide would do. In doing so, he became the most active, most visible figure in the water. What followed was not a sequence that anyone on the boat could describe with clarity afterward. It happened too fast and with too much chaos for that. The shark came in hard, a sudden strike, contact, and then the water around Ahmed erupted into confusion. Snorkelers were screaming, scrambling for the ladder, the crew pulling people aboard with both hands. Someone threw a line, someone else was in the way. The shark was still in the water, still moving, and the group between Ahmed and the boat made retrieval nearly impossible to coordinate. Ahmed sustained fatal injuries before the chaos on the surface could be resolved enough to reach him. By the time the last snorkeler was aboard and the crew could focus entirely on Ahmed, it was too late. He was pulled from the water, but he was already gone. Egyptian maritime authorities opened a formal investigation within 24 hours. The site was closed to tourist operations for 6 weeks and reopened with new protocols, mandatory pre-dive water checks, stricter group positioning guidelines, and emergency signaling requirements for all guides.